Ever wonder how a company makes that huge leap into a totally new country? I mean, it's one of the biggest bets a business can possibly make. Well, today, we're going to break down the playbook for global expansion, and we'll do it using the incredible 40-year story of one company as our guide. Let's dive in. So, check out this picture. It really tells you everything you need to know about our story today. It's about the British construction giant JCB and how this one super risky move into the promising but really challenging market of India way back in the 1970s ended up defining their entire future. All right, let's rewind the clock to 1979. JCB looks at India and sees just massive potential. It's a huge developing nation, and it's got this growing need for construction. But getting in? Yeah, that was not going to be easy. At the time, India's market was heavily protected. So you might be thinking, why couldn't JCB just ship their equipment over from the UK? Well, there were two huge roadblocks. First, the tariff barriers were so high it made exporting ridiculously expensive. And second, there were strict government regulations that basically forced foreign companies to partner up with a local firm. So JCB's only real move was to find an Indian partner and build from the inside. So they created a joint venture with a local engineering company called Escorts. But look at this split. JCB only got a 40% stake. They were the minority partner. They had to give up majority control just to get a foot in the door. Talk about a huge compromise. Okay, let's jump forward 20 years. That bet they made, it paid off. Big time. The joint venture was a massive success. But here's the funny thing. That success created a whole new set of problems for JCB. Get this, an 80% market share. They weren't just successful, they completely dominated the Indian market for their equipment. But this is where the story starts to get a little complicated. This really gets to the heart of the trade-off they were facing. On the one hand, the joint venture got them into this incredibly valuable market. But on the other, as the minority partner, JCB was getting nervous. They were afraid their cutting-edge manufacturing technology might leak to their partner, Escorts, who could, turn into a competitor down the line. They couldn't really go all in and invest more without having full control. But then, things started to change. The Indian government began to relax its rules on foreign investment, and JCB saw their moment. This was their chance to pivot from just being a partner to becoming the outright owner. You can see their patient, step-by-step game plan right here. It wasn't an overnight thing. In 1999, they bought just enough shares to get 60% majority control. Then, just 3 years later, they bought out the rest, creating a wholly owned subsidiary. That move gave them the confidence to invest heavily, and by 2022, well, the payoff was complete. Think about that, almost half of all their global sales now come from India. That initial risky 40% bet turned into the single most important market for the entire company. That is an absolutely staggering return on their investment. And this quote just says it all, doesn't it? The gamble, the long game they played, that strategic pivot, it all led to India becoming the most valuable piece of their entire global empire, the jewel in the crown. Okay, so that's a pretty incredible story. But what does it actually teach us? Let's take that success and deconstruct it into a playbook that pretty much any company can use when they're thinking about going global. This really is the key question, right? Because we can take JCB's decades-long journey and distill it down into a clear, strategic framework for making these massive, company-defining decisions. And it really all boils down to these three fundamental questions. First, which countries actually offer the best long-term shot? Second, when is the right time to make your move? Do you go in early like JCB or wait? And finally, on what scale do you go in? How big of a commitment are you going to make right from the start? So once you decide to go for it, you've got a few ways to actually enter that market. And JCB's story is a classic example of this evolution. They tried exporting, but it was a non-starter because of the trade barriers. So they pivoted to a joint venture, which was required by the regulations. And finally, when the rules changed and they needed more control, they went for the wholly owned subsidiary. See, each step was exactly the right move for that specific time. Now let's focus on what might be the most important decision of all. How do you even pick a country in the first place? Well, it usually comes down to a simple but really powerful little equation. You have to balance these three things. First, what are the benefits? For JCB, that was a no-brainer. India's massive growth potential. Then, what are the costs? In their case, high tariffs and a ton of tough regulations. And finally, what are the risks? For them, it was navigating a political system that was constantly in flux. The most attractive markets are always the ones where those long-term benefits just totally outweigh the costs and the risks. So, if there's one key takeaway here, it's this. The best bets are usually countries that are politically stable and have market based economies. And why is that? It's simple. Those factors lower your costs and your risks, which makes it way easier to cash in on all the benefits.
And that brings us to a final thought for you. Now that you've got the playbook, think about it for a second. If you had to choose a new country for a business to expand into today, which one would you pick? And based on everything we've talked about, what would your first move be? Would you just export, form a partnership, or would you go all in from day one? The right answer, as JCB proved, can literally change everything.